In the polished halls of Riverside Mall, where luxury stores meet daily life, a single accusation shatters the carefully constructed facade of social progress. A designer purse, a distinguished doctor, and a successful realtor become entangled in a moment that will ripple through their entire community. But in this story of prejudice and redemption, it's not the mistake that matters most. It's what happens when the cameras stop rolling and real change begins. Sarah Chen hurried through the polished marble halls of the Riverside Mall, her designer heels clicking against the floor in perfect rhythm with her racing heartbeat. The shopping center's usual weekend bustle felt suffocating today, particularly after the stressful morning she'd had at her real estate office. A failed closing, an angry client, and now her favorite leather purse was missing. She remembered placing it on the chair next to her at the mall's coffee shop, the Daily Grind, where she'd stopped to answer some urgent emails. Now, 15 minutes later, she'd returned to find it gone. The purse contained not just her wallet and phone, but also the contracts she needed for Monday's presentation. As panic began to set in, Sarah's eyes darted around the food court. That's when she spotted him, a tall black man in an impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit, carrying a brown leather purse that looked exactly like hers. He was walking purposefully toward the mall's east exit, and something about his hurried pace triggered an immediate reaction in her. "Hey, stop right there!" Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the crowded space. Several heads turned, but the man kept walking, apparently not realizing she was addressing him. This only fueled her suspicion. Sarah's heart pounded as she quickened her pace, her assumptions crystallizing into certainty with each step. "Security!" she called out, waving frantically at a nearby mall officer. "That man has my purse." The security guard, Officer Mike Thompson, responded immediately, moving to intercept the man in the suit. As he approached, the man finally stopped, a look of confusion crossing his face. "Sir, would you mind staying right there for a moment?" Officer Thompson asked professionally, positioning himself between the man and the exit. The man in the suit furrowed his brow, glancing between Sarah and the security guard. "Is there a problem?" His voice was deep and measured, with the careful articulation of someone used to speaking in professional settings. "That's my purse you're carrying," Sarah declared, pointing at the brown leather bag in his hand. "I left it at the Daily Grind, and you must have taken it." The man's expression shifted from confusion to something more complex, a mixture of weariness and resignation that seemed to age him instantly. "Ma'am, this is my briefcase. I'm Marcus Washington, Executive Director at Riverside Children's Hospital. I've been carrying this same briefcase for the past 3 years." By now, a small crowd had gathered, maintaining a respectful distance, but watching the scene unfold with undisguised interest. Sarah felt her cheeks grow hot, but she pressed on. "It looks exactly like my purse. I demand you open it right now." Officer Thompson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sir, would you mind showing us the contents of your bag, just to clear this up quickly?" Marcus's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Actually, I would mind. This briefcase contains confidential patient information, and I'm legally obligated to protect it. However," he reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a business card. "You're welcome to verify my identity and position." The security guard accepted the card, studying it carefully before speaking into his radio. "Janet, could you check the security footage around the Daily Grind from the past 20 minutes? We're looking for a missing purse." A young barista from the Daily Grind, who had been watching the scene unfold, suddenly rushed forward. "Mrs. Chen, is this your purse?" She held up a brown leather bag that was indeed nearly identical to Marcus's briefcase. "You left it hanging on your chair. I was about to turn it in to Lost and Found." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's face drained of color as she realized her terrible mistake. But for Marcus Washington, this wasn't just an embarrassing moment. It was another reminder of the assumptions he faced regularly, despite his position and accomplishments. Marcus adjusted his tie, a gesture that seemed more about gathering thoughts than fixing his already immaculate appearance. "Officer Thompson, am I free to go? I have a meeting with the hospital board in 20 minutes. The security guard nodded quickly, obviously embarrassed. "Of course, sir. I apologize for the inconvenience." Sarah stood frozen, her own purse now clutched tightly in her hands, as Marcus turned to leave. But instead of walking away immediately, he paused. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only Sarah and Officer Thompson could hear. You know, I almost skipped getting my coffee this morning because I was running late, but I told myself that I deserved the same simple pleasures as anyone else without having to worry about how others might perceive me. I've been living in this city for 15 years. I've saved countless children's lives as a pediatric surgeon before moving into hospital administration. I serve on 3 charitable boards, and yet... He left the sentence unfinished, but its weight hung in the air. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but Marcus wasn't done speaking. The thing is, Mrs. Chen, I recognize your name. Last month, your real estate firm handled the purchase of a new property for our hospital's outpatient clinic. You never met me in person, but you spoke to me on the phone several times. You said I had a wonderful phone presence. I wonder, would you have said the same thing if we had met in person first? The growing crowd of onlookers had begun to disperse, but their judging glances lingered. Sarah noticed an elderly white woman shaking her head disapprovingly, at her, not at Marcus. A group of teenagers were whispering and pointing, one of them apparently recording the incident on their phone. The public shame was overwhelming, but Sarah realized that it was nothing compared to what Marcus must have felt when she accused him. Officer Thompson, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, tried to smooth things over. "Sir, if you'd like to file a complaint..." Marcus shook his head. "That won't be necessary, but I would like to suggest that the mall consider implementing some bias training for its security staff and retailers, not to point fingers, but to prevent situations like this from happening to someone else who might not be in a position to defend themselves as easily as I can." Sarah found her voice, though it came out shaky. "Mr. Washington, I am so sorry. I don't know what to say. I'm mortified. My behavior was inexcusable." "You're right, it was inexcusable," Marcus agreed, checking his watch. "But what matters now is what you learn from this moment. Will this be just an embarrassing memory that you try to forget? Or will it be the beginning of real change in how you view and treat others?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah noticed details she had missed in her earlier panic. The monogrammed initials on the corner of his briefcase, the hospital ID badge partially visible in his breast pocket, the wedding ring on his finger, and the small pin on his lapel, showing he was a board member of the local arts council. A young black woman who had been watching the scene approached Marcus. "Dr. Washington, I just wanted to say, thank you. My daughter was your patient 3 years ago. The surgery you performed saved her life." Marcus's stern expression softened slightly. "Emily Rodriguez? How is she doing?" "She just made the honor roll," the woman said proudly, then turned to give Sarah a cold look. "She wants to be a doctor now, because of him." The layers of shame continued to build as Sarah realized just how many assumptions she had made and how those assumptions were now being witnessed and judged by others. Her phone buzzed in her purse, probably another work email about Monday's presentation. But for the first time that day, it didn't seem important. Marcus checked his watch again. "I need to head to my meeting. Mrs. Chen, I hope you understand why this interaction has been particularly disappointing. Your firm has been handling all the real estate acquisitions for our hospital's expansion project. We've been planning to break ground on a new pediatric cancer center next month. Given today's events, I think it's best if we review our business relationship with your firm." Sarah felt her professional world tilting on its axis. One moment of prejudice threatened to undo years of hard work and a multi-million-dollar business relationship. But even more than that, she felt the crushing weight of having perpetuated the exact kind of discrimination she, as an Asian American woman, had faced herself throughout her career. The mall's regular announcements continued to play overhead, advertising sales and store events, creating a surreal backdrop to the intense human drama unfolding below. A child's laughter echoed from the nearby play area, reminding everyone that life was continuing normally just a few feet away, even as this moment was changing multiple lives forever. Officer Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "Dr. Washington, please let me personally apologize for how this situation was handled. I should have asked more questions before intervening." "You were doing your job, Officer Thompson," Marcus replied. "But perhaps this is an opportunity to examine how that job is done. Every interaction like this leaves a mark, not just on the individuals involved, but on our entire community." Sarah watched as Marcus began to walk away, his straight posture and dignified bearing unchanged despite the ordeal. She had a choice to make: let him walk away or take the first step toward making this right. But what could she possibly say that wouldn't sound like an empty platitude? The answer came from an unexpected source. The barista who had found Sarah's purse stepped forward again. "Dr. Washington, your usual coffee order is ready. It's on the house today." Marcus paused, and for the first time, a small smile crossed his face. "Thank you, Anna, but I insist on paying. Accepting special treatment now would defeat the purpose of what I was trying to explain." He turned back to Sarah. "Mrs. Chen, I have a proposition for you. If you're truly interested in making amends, the hospital is hosting a diversity and inclusion workshop next week. It's mandatory for all our staff and open to community partners. Your entire firm would be welcome to attend." The invitation hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah knew her response in this moment would define not just her professional future, but her personal legacy. The security camera above them continued to record silently, documenting every second of this interaction for posterity. Meanwhile, the regular rhythm of mall life continued around them. Shoppers pushed past with their bags, teenagers lounged by the fountain, and somewhere in the distance, a store's security alarm went off, causing several heads to turn. Sarah noticed how some people instinctively clutched their bags closer. Another small reminder of the prejudices that played out every day in subtle and not so subtle ways. Sarah took a deep breath. "Yes, absolutely. I'll make sure our entire office attends. And Mr. Washington, Dr. Washington, I know an apology isn't enough, but I want you to know that I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." "Making it right isn't about making me feel better, Mrs. Chen," Marcus replied, his voice taking on the patient tone of an experienced educator. "It's about understanding why this happened and ensuring it doesn't happen to anyone else." Just then, a tall woman in surgical scrubs rushed up to Marcus, slightly out of breath. "Dr. Washington, I've been trying to reach you. The Torres baby's stats are dropping, and the parents are asking specifically for you to consult." The professional mask slipped for a moment as concern flickered across Marcus's face. He quickly opened his briefcase, the action drawing all eyes after the recent accusation, and pulled out a tablet. Sarah caught a glimpse of medical charts and children's photos before he closed it again. "Send the latest numbers to my tablet. I'll review them on my way to the board meeting and stop by PICU right after." He turned back to Sarah. "Life has a way of putting things in perspective, doesn't it? While we've been standing here dealing with this situation, there's a 6-month-old fighting for his life in my hospital." The surgeon hurried away, but not before giving Sarah a curious look, clearly wondering about the tension in the air. Marcus's phone buzzed again, and he glanced at it with a frown. "It seems video of our interaction is already circulating on social media," he said quietly. "The hospital's PR team is requesting a statement. Mrs. Chen, I want you to understand something. What happens next isn't just about you and me. This incident will likely go viral, and both our reputations, personal and professional, will be affected." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She hadn't considered the broader implications in today's connected world. One moment of prejudice could become a permanent digital scar, affecting not just her, but her entire firm. The mall's security officer, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped forward again. "Dr. Washington, we have the security footage if you need it for any purpose. And Mrs. Chen, the mall would appreciate your cooperation if this incident leads to any formal investigation or training requirements." "Of course," Sarah managed to say, her mind racing. She thought about her own daughter, currently away at college studying sociology. What would she think when she saw her mother's face plastered across social media as another example of racial profiling? Marcus checked his watch one final time. "I really need to go. Mrs. Chen, expect an email from our hospital's diversity officer about next week's workshop. And," he paused, considering his next words carefully, "I suggest you take some time to reflect on what happened here today. Real change starts with uncomfortable self-examination." As he turned to leave again, a group of young black professionals who had been watching the scene blocked his path. One of them, a young man in business casual attire, spoke up. "Dr. Washington, we saw what happened. We just wanted to say, we've all been there. Thank you for handling it with such grace. You're showing us how to navigate these situations with dignity." Marcus's professional demeanor softened slightly. "What's your name, young man?" "James Thompson. I'm a first-year resident at Metro General." Dr. Thompson, dignity is crucial, but so is speaking truth to power. Never let anyone make you feel that you need to accept mistreatment gracefully. My response today was my choice, but it might not be the right choice for everyone in every situation. The growing crowd murmured in agreement. Sarah noticed that many people had their phones out, undoubtedly sharing the incident on various social platforms. She saw her own face reflected in their screens, the embodiment of prejudice caught in 4K resolution. A mall custodian who had been cleaning nearby spoke up, his voice carrying a Caribbean lilt. "You know, I see this kind of thing more often than you'd think. People clutching their bags when certain folks walk by, following some shoppers around stores, but not others. Most times, nobody says anything. It just becomes part of the air we breathe." Marcus nodded slowly. "Which is exactly why we need to address these incidents when they happen. Silence perpetuates the problem." He turned back to Sarah. "Mrs. Chen, I noticed earlier that you have a Stop Asian Hate pin on your laptop bag. I imagine you understand what it's like to face prejudice, which makes this situation all the more—" He left the sentence unfinished, but Sarah felt its weight crush her. She did know better. As an Asian American woman in real estate, she'd faced countless microaggressions and outright discrimination. How many times had potential clients assumed she was the assistant rather than the agent? How often had she been complimented on her perfect English? And yet, here she was, perpetuating the same toxic prejudices against another person of color. The crowd continued to grow, with people stopping to watch and record. The incident was taking on a life of its own, becoming something larger than just a misunderstanding between two people. It was becoming a moment of public reckoning, a mirror held up to society's ongoing struggles with racial bias. The young barista who had found Sarah's purse approached again, this time with a coffee cup in hand. "Dr. Washington, your coffee's getting cold, and I just wanted to say, my brother wants to apply to medical school. Would it be okay if he reached out to you for advice?" Marcus accepted the coffee with a nod. "Of course, Anna. Have him email my office." He paused, then added, "You know, when I was applying to medical school, I had exactly one black mentor. Just one. That's why I make time for mentoring now, despite everything else on my plate." The growing crowd had begun to affect mall operations. Officer Thompson was quietly radioing for additional security to help manage the gathering, while store employees peered out from their entrances, trying to understand the source of the commotion. Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from Twitter. Someone had tagged her business account in a post about the incident. Her hands trembled as she read the caption. "Watch this realtor accuse prominent black doctor of theft at Riverside Mall. Racial profiling. Accuses, doing business while black." The post already had hundreds of retweets. A woman pushing a stroller approached Marcus, her eyes bright with recognition. "Dr. Washington? You performed my son's heart surgery 2 years ago." She turned the stroller to reveal a healthy-looking toddler playing with a tablet. "I never got to properly thank you. We tried to send cards to the hospital, but—" "Marcus Washington?" A new voice cut through the crowd. Everyone turned to see an elderly black man making his way forward, leaning on a cane. He wore a security guard's uniform, though not from the mall. "I worked security at Riverside Hospital for 30 years before retiring last year," the man said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "Used to see you coming in at all hours, even as a resident. Can't count how many times I had to verify your ID, even after you became chief of surgery. Some nights, you'd be dead on your feet after a 12-hour operation, and still, someone would stop you, question you." The old guard turned to Sarah. "Ma'am, do you know what he used to say to me after those incidents? He'd say, 'Mr. Johnson, don't let it bother you. One day, things will be different.'" The man's voice cracked slightly. "Been hearing that my whole life. One day. Well, I'm 73 years old now, still waiting on that one day." The weight of history seemed to press down on everyone present. Sarah felt tears rolling down her cheeks, but she didn't dare wipe them away. She didn't deserve to make this moment about her emotional reaction. Marcus's phone buzzed yet again. He glanced at it and his expression tightened. "The hospital board is waiting. Mrs. Chen, this situation has clearly grown beyond just us. I suggest you contact your firm's PR team immediately. The hospital's legal department will be in touch about our ongoing contracts." But before he could leave, a new commotion arose near the mall entrance. A group of reporters had somehow gotten wind of the situation and were making their way through the crowd, cameras and microphones extended. "Dr. Washington, can you comment on the incident that just occurred?" "Mrs. Chen, are you aware this video has gone viral?" "Dr. Washington, as a prominent member of the medical community, what message do you have about racial profiling?" Officer Thompson quickly moved to intervene, but the damage was done. What had started as a personal incident had now become a full-blown media event. Marcus raised his hand for silence, his practiced hospital administrator's demeanor taking over. "I will make a brief statement. What occurred here today is unfortunately not unique. It's a reminder that success, education, and professional achievement do not shield people of color from racial profiling. However, this should not be seen as just another viral moment for social media. It should be a catalyst for real change in how we view and treat each other." He turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Chen, I believe you have an opportunity here. Your reaction to this incident will demonstrate whether you truly understand the impact of your actions. Will you use this as a moment for genuine growth and community leadership, or will you retreat into defensive posturing and legal protection?" The reporters pressed closer, cameras flashing. Sarah realized that her next words would be broadcast across social media and local news. Her daughter would see this. Her clients would see this. Her entire community would see this. A young black security guard who had just arrived on the scene leaned over to Officer Thompson and whispered something. Thompson's eyes widened, and he quickly made his way to Marcus. "Dr. Washington," he said quietly, but Sarah was close enough to hear. "Sir, your office just called. The Torres baby's condition has worsened. They need you at the hospital immediately." For the first time, Marcus's professional composure cracked slightly. Sarah saw the conflict in his eyes. Stay and manage this situation that had broader implications for his community, or rush to the aid of a patient in need. The elderly Mr. Johnson spoke up again. "Go, son. Go save that baby. Some battles can wait, others can't." The reporters continued shouting questions, but Marcus was already pulling out his phone, presumably to call the hospital. Sarah noticed his hands were shaking slightly, not from fear or anger, but from the urgent need to attend to his patient. And in that moment, the full impact of her actions hit her. While she had been accusing this man of theft, his mind had been on saving children's lives. While she had been defending her unfounded suspicions, he had been carrying the weight of countless responsibilities, including the literal life and death decisions that awaited him at the hospital. "I need to go," Marcus said firmly, already turning toward the exit. "Mrs. Chen, this situation has revealed deep-seated issues that need addressing. But right now, a child needs me more than this conversation does." Just then, Sarah's phone rang. It was her managing partner, David Goldman. She let it go to voicemail, knowing exactly why he was calling. The video must have reached him already. Her firm handled millions in commercial real estate for the hospital. Years of relationship building, potentially destroyed in minutes. One of the reporters called out, "Mrs. Chen, your firm's website states a commitment to diversity and inclusion. How do you reconcile that with your actions today?" Before Sarah could respond, another voice cut through the crowd. "I can speak to that." A middle-aged black woman in an elegant business suit stepped forward. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized Patricia Williams, the chair of the city's Chamber of Commerce. "I've worked with Mrs. Chen's firm," Patricia continued, addressing the reporters. "They've won awards for their diversity initiatives, which makes this incident all the more concerning. It shows how surface-level commitments to diversity can mask deeper biases that need to be addressed." Marcus was still there, clearly torn between his need to leave and the important conversation unfolding. The young resident, Dr. Thompson, stepped forward again. "Dr. Washington, I can drive you to the hospital. You can make your calls from my car." A look of relief crossed Marcus's face. "Thank you, Dr. Thompson." He turned to address the crowd one final time. "What happened here today isn't just about me, or Mrs. Chen, or even this specific incident. It's about the countless similar interactions that happen every day without cameras present. It's about the toll these assumptions take on their targets. It's about the work we all need to do to create real change." As he turned to leave with Dr. Thompson, Sarah found her voice. "Dr. Washington, wait. The workshop next week, would you consider letting me share this story? The whole story? My story? Not to defend myself, but to show others how these biases can exist even in people who think they're above them." Marcus paused briefly. That's a start, Mrs. Chen. But remember, the goal isn't to absolve yourself of guilt. It's to create genuine change. He checked his phone again and frowned. The Torres baby's oxygen levels are dropping. I need to go. As Marcus hurried away with Dr. Thompson, the reporters turned their full attention to Sarah. Camera lights blazed, microphones thrust forward. Patricia Williams stood nearby, arms crossed, watching to see how Sarah would handle this moment. The young barista, Anna, who had found Sarah's purse, spoke up unexpectedly. I see Dr. Washington here almost every morning. He always asks about my classes at community college, remembers my mom's health issues, tips generously. He's the kind of person who makes everyone feel seen and valued. And today, she paused, wiping away tears. Today he was treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin. Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from her daughter. Mom, what's going on? Your video is all over my timeline. Please tell me this isn't what it looks like. The mall's regular announcements continued overhead, advertising sales and events, creating an almost surreal backdrop to the intense scene still unfolding. Officer Thompson was coordinating with his team to manage the crowd, which had grown even larger. Mr. Johnson, the retired hospital security guard, made his way closer to Sarah. You know, he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of years, I've seen all kinds of reactions when people get caught in these situations. Some get defensive, some cry and apologize, some hire PR firms to manage the damage, but very few actually do the hard work of changing. Sarah noticed a group of young black shoppers watching the scene, their own shopping bags clutched tightly. Whether from habit or in response to what they'd just witnessed, she couldn't tell. The weight of their gazes made her understand, perhaps for the first time, the constant awareness they must carry. Mrs. Chen, Patricia Williams said, her voice firm but not unkind. Your firm has been chosen to receive an award at next month's Chamber of Commerce Gala for your work with minority-owned businesses. In light of today's events, I think we need to have a serious discussion about that. The reporters pressed closer, sensing another angle to the story. Sarah could see the headlines now. Award-winning real estate firm caught in racial profiling incident. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Someone had dug up an old social media post of hers from the previous year, where she'd written passionately about her own experiences with discrimination. The irony was devastating. A mall maintenance worker who had been watching everything unfold spoke up, addressing no one in particular. You know what's sad? Tomorrow we'll all go back to our normal lives. But some of us will still get followed around stores, still get asked if we belong in certain neighborhoods, still have to prove we have a right to be wherever we are. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from the hospital board. Due to recent events, an emergency meeting has been called to review all current contracts with Chen and Associates Real Estate. Please expect further communication from our legal department. The implications were staggering. The hospital's expansion project was worth millions, but more than that, it represented hundreds of future jobs, improved healthcare access for underserved communities, and years of planned development for the neighborhood. One of the reporters raised her hand, a local journalist Sarah recognized from the business section of the city paper. Mrs. Chen, your firm has been vocal about supporting minority-owned businesses in the community. Just last month, you sponsored the Black Business Leaders Conference. Was that genuine commitment or just good PR? Before Sarah could answer, another notification popped up on her phone, a message from her largest commercial client. Need to discuss recent social media situation. Urgent. The dominoes were falling, one by one. Patricia Williams stepped forward again. I think what we're seeing here is the difference between performative allyship and genuine understanding. Mrs. Chen, your firm has done good work, but today's incident suggests that the real work, the internal work, remains undone. A young black woman in the crowd called out, I interviewed at your firm last month. You talked about your commitment to diversity for 20 minutes during my interview. Was that all just talk? The situation was spiraling. Each question, each revelation, peeled back another layer of contradiction between Sarah's public persona and her private assumptions. Officer Thompson's radio crackled to life. Sir, hospital update. Dr. Washington has arrived and gone straight into surgery with the Torres baby. Local news vans are setting up in the mall parking lot. The crowd murmured, Even in the midst of this public relations nightmare, Marcus was focused on saving lives. The contrast was stark and damning. Sarah's assistant called next. Mrs. Chen, Dr. Rivera from the Diversity Committee is asking to make a statement. She says as one of our only black brokers, she feels pressured to comment. What should I tell her? The weight of responsibility pressed down on Sarah. Dr. Rivera had been her hire, a point of pride in her firm's diversity initiatives. Now she was putting her in an impossible position. Mrs. Chen, Patricia Williams said, her voice cutting through the chaos. The Chamber of Commerce has been working on a new initiative to combat discrimination in local businesses. Perhaps this is an opportunity to turn this incident into something meaningful, but it would require complete transparency about what happened here today. The reporters leaned in, cameras ready. A notification popped up on the mall's public announcement screen. Due to today's events, the mall management will be hosting an emergency community forum on racial profiling and retail discrimination next week. All store owners and managers are required to attend. Sarah's phone lit up with another text from her daughter. Mom, my friends are asking me about this. What am I supposed to say? What really happened? The young barista, Anna, who had been watching everything unfold, spoke up again. You know what's ironic? Dr. Washington was just telling me this morning about a mentorship program he's starting for minority students interested in medicine. He said something about how representation matters at every level, from the hospital board to the maintenance staff. Mr. Johnson nodded slowly. That's who he is, always thinking about the bigger picture, even while dealing with the day-to-day indignities. The question is, Mrs. Chen, who are you? When people look back on this day, what story will they tell about how you responded? A local community activist who had arrived with the reporters raised her hand. Mrs. Chen, would you be willing to participate in a public dialogue about this incident? Not a PR statement, but a real, honest conversation about bias in our community? The mall's security camera continued its silent vigil, recording every moment of this unfolding drama. Somewhere in the hospital across town, Marcus Washington was likely scrubbing in for surgery, setting aside the morning's humiliation to focus on saving a life. Sarah's phone buzzed one more time, an email from the hospital's diversity officer. In light of today's events, we're expanding next week's workshop to include local business leaders and community members. Your story could be a powerful teaching moment, if you're willing to be completely honest about your actions and their implications. The choice before her was clear. She could try to manage this crisis with PR statements and legal teams, or she could embrace the uncomfortable truth and try to create real change. But the latter would require more than just words. It would demand action, accountability, and a willingness to be vulnerable in front of her entire community. Sarah felt everyone's eyes on her as she looked down at her phone one more time. Among the flood of notifications was a LinkedIn update. Someone had already edited her professional profile to add, known for racial profiling incident at Riverside Mall. The digital scarlet letter was being etched in real time. Sarah began, then stopped. What could she possibly say that wouldn't sound like damage control? Just then, a tall woman in medical scrubs pushed through the crowd. Excuse me, I just came from the hospital. Dr. Washington wanted me to deliver a message. The reporters immediately turned their cameras toward the newcomer. I'm Dr. Susan Martinez, Chief of Pediatrics at Riverside. I was just in surgery with Dr. Washington, the Torres baby. She paused, gathering herself. The operation was successful. That child will live because Dr. Washington dropped everything to come perform emergency surgery. And you know what he said to me between saving that baby's life and scrubbing out? The crowd leaned in. He said, make sure Mrs. Chen knows that this isn't just about her or me. Tell her to think about that baby's mother, a black woman who had to trust a system that hasn't always been trustworthy. Tell her to think about that baby growing up in a world where someone might assume the worst about him because of his skin color. Tell her that's why this matters. Sarah felt her legs go weak. Patricia Williams steadied her with a firm hand. The press will want a statement, Patricia said quietly. But more importantly, the community needs to see real action. Officer Thompson's radio crackled again. Sir, hospital protesters are gathering. They're calling for a review of all contracts with Chen and Associates. A young black mother in the crowd spoke up, bouncing a baby on her hip. You know what scares me? My son is going to grow up to be a tall black man someday. He He might become a doctor like Dr. Washington. But will that protect him from people like, well, people like me, Sarah finished quietly. Her phone buzzed again. The local news had picked up the story. Prominent realtor accused of racial profiling against hospital executive. Anna, the barista, stepped forward again. Dr. Washington comes in every morning, orders the same thing, asks about my classes. He wrote me a recommendation letter for college. He's not just some random black man with a briefcase. He's part of our community. But today, none of that mattered, did it? Sarah's assistant called again. Mrs. Chen, the diversity committee is asking if they should release a statement. And 3 of our black employees have called in sick for tomorrow. The ripples were becoming waves. You know, Mr. Johnson said, leaning on his cane, when I was a young security guard, I had to show my ID 3 times just to enter the hospital where I worked. Dr. Washington changed that policy when he became chief of surgery, said no employee should have to prove they belong in their own workplace. That's the man you accused of theft today. Patricia Williams checked her phone. The Chamber of Commerce Board is convening an emergency session to discuss this incident. Mrs. Chen, they're requesting your presence. More reporters had arrived. The story was growing, but beneath the media circus and professional consequences, there was something more fundamental at stake. A new message appeared on Sarah's phone, from Marcus Washington himself. Mrs. Chen, the Torres baby will live. While you process what happened today, remember that life goes on. People still need help. Communities still need healing. The question is, will you be part of the problem or part of the solution? By the way, I've asked the hospital board to hold off on canceling your contracts. Not for your sake, but for the communities those projects will serve. What you do with this chance is up to you. Sarah looked up at the crowd, at the cameras, at the faces showing everything from anger to disappointment to hope for change. She thought about her daughter in college, studying sociology, probably watching this unfold on social media. She thought about Dr. Rivera, her black broker, being asked to comment on her boss's actions. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but also offered a strange kind of clarity. This wasn't about saving her reputation or her contracts. This was about something much bigger than her. I'd like to make a statement, she said finally, her voice stronger than she expected. Before I say anything else, Sarah began, I want to be clear that this statement isn't rehearsed or filtered through PR. What you're about to hear is raw and honest, because that's what this moment demands. The reporters raised their microphones higher, phones recorded from every angle. Today, I did something unforgivable. I saw a successful black man in a suit and automatically assumed he was a thief. I'm not going to make excuses about being stressed or having a bad day. The truth is uglier than that. Despite all my public statements about diversity, despite my own experiences with discrimination as an Asian American woman, despite all the diversity training sessions I've hosted, I still carried these biases. And today they hurt someone who has done nothing but serve this community. She paused, fighting back tears. But Dr. Washington is right. This isn't about making me feel better. This isn't about saving my contracts or my reputation. This is about the poison of prejudice that lives in all of us, even those who think they're immune. Patricia Williams nodded slowly, a look of cautious approval on her face. Effective immediately, I'm stepping down as CEO of Chen and Associates, Sarah continued, her voice shaking slightly. The crowd gasped. Our firm's leadership should reflect our stated values. Dr. Rivera, our senior black broker, will be taking over as interim CEO. Her phone immediately exploded with messages from board members and stakeholders, but she pressed on. Furthermore, I'm requesting that the hospital board maintain their contracts with the firm, not for my sake, but because those projects will bring healthcare access to underserved communities. I will personally donate my entire year's salary to establish a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing medical careers in Dr. Washington's name. The young resident, Dr. Thompson, who had driven Marcus to the hospital, pushed through the crowd. Mrs. Chen, Dr. Washington asked me to give you an update. He's still in surgery, but he wanted you to know that the Torres baby's vitals are stable. He said that real change happens in moments like this, when we choose growth over defensiveness. Anna, the barista, spoke up again. The coffee shop where this all started, we've never had formal bias training. Most of us are college students just trying to make ends meet, but we see discrimination every day. We just don't know what to do about it. Sarah turned to face her. Then let's change that. I'm offering to fund comprehensive bias training for every retail employee in this mall. Not the superficial kind, real ongoing education about recognizing and confronting prejudice. Officer Thompson stepped forward. The mall security team would appreciate being included in that training, ma'am. More phones buzzed as the story updated in real time. Real estate CEO steps down, following racial profiling incident, announces major changes. Mr. Johnson, the retired security guard, wiped a tear from his eye. You know, in all my years, I've never seen someone respond to getting caught like this. Usually it's all lawyers and PR statements. A small boy in the crowd tugged on his mother's sleeve. Mom, what's happening? The mother, a black woman in her 30s, knelt down. We're watching someone learn that saying sorry isn't enough. You have to change things. Sarah's phone rang again, her daughter. This time, she answered on speaker. Mom, I saw everything. I'm proud of you. Not for what happened, but for what you're doing about it. The crowd fell silent. Patricia Williams stepped forward. The Chamber of Commerce would be interested in partnering with you on expanding these initiatives citywide. Not with you as CEO, but perhaps in a different role. As someone who can speak honestly about confronting their own biases. Another update from the hospital appeared on Sarah's phone. Dr. Washington has completed the surgery. The Torres family would like to thank everyone for their prayers and support. And Mrs. Chen, Dr. Washington says your actions today will mean more than your words. He'll be watching. 6 months later, the auditorium at Riverside Hospital was packed. On stage, Marcus Washington stood at the podium, his familiar briefcase, the one that had sparked everything, resting beside him. Today marks the opening of our new pediatric care center, he began, but it also marks 6 months since an incident that changed our community. Many of you know the story. Some of you watched it unfold. But what you might not know is what happened after the camera stopped rolling. In the audience, Sarah Chen sat quietly in the back row. She wasn't a featured speaker today. That wasn't her place anymore. Instead, she was there to witness the fruits of what her lowest moment had sparked. In the past 6 months, Marcus continued, every retail business in Riverside Mall has completed comprehensive bias training. The Chen and Associates Scholarship Fund has already supported 15 minority students pursuing medical careers. And under Dr. Rivera's leadership, the firm has become a model for corporate diversity transformation. Sarah glanced around the room. Anna, the barista, was there, now a pre-med student herself, one of the scholarship recipients. Mr. Johnson sat in the front row, no longer needing his cane. Officer Thompson and his entire security team were present, wearing new badges that identified them as certified diversity advocates. But the real change, Marcus said, can't be measured in programs or initiatives. It's measured in the daily interactions that don't make headlines. It's measured in the young black doctor who can walk through our halls without being stopped and questioned. It's measured in the security guard who thinks twice before making assumptions. It's measured in the lasting change that comes when we confront our biases honestly. The Torres baby, now a healthy 7-month-old, cooed in his mother's arms in the front row. Mrs. Chen, Marcus continued, causing Sarah to straighten in her seat. Would you please stand? Sarah rose slowly, her heart pounding. This woman could have chosen the easy path, issue a press release, wait for the story to blow over, protect her business interests. Instead, she chose to do something remarkable. She chose to become a catalyst for real change, even at great personal cost. Sarah felt tears welling up, but these were different from the tears of shame she'd shed 6 months ago. Today, as we open this new center that will serve thousands of children from all backgrounds, we're not just celebrating a building, we're celebrating the possibility of transformation. Mrs. Chen showed us that even our worst moments can become opportunities for growth, if we're brave enough to embrace them. Marcus picked up his briefcase, the same one Sarah had once accused him of stealing. This briefcase now sits in my office as a reminder, not of that day's shame, but of what can happen when we confront our biases head-on and commit to real change. The Torres baby let out a happy gurgle, drawing gentle laughter from the crowd. The work isn't finished, Marcus concluded. It may never be finished, but today, in this room, we have proof that change is possible, that one moment of confronting our biases can spark a movement, that we can build something meaningful from our mistakes. He paused, looking directly at Sarah. The question was never about what happened that day in the mall. The question was always about what would happen next. And thanks to everyone in this room, what happened next was transformation. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Sarah remained standing, tears flowing freely now. Her daughter, home from college, squeezed her hand. On her phone, a news alert popped up. Riverside Hospital's new pediatric center opens, a story of transformation. But it wasn't the headline that caught her eye. It was the small plaque she could see from her seat, mounted beside the center's entrance. Dedicated to the belief that change begins with honesty, grows through accountability, and blooms in transformation. In honor of every person who has ever had to prove they belong.